Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Chapter 51, The Spirit-Spout. Days and weeks went by, and under gentle sails, the ivory Pequod slowly drifted across 4 different cruising grounds. Off the Azores, off the Cape Verde Islands, at the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, and the Carroll Ground, a non-specific area of water south of St. Helena. One calm, moonlit night, as the waves rolled by like silver scrolls and their gentle movements created a silvery silence, a bright jet of spray was spotted ahead of the white bubbles at the bow. Illuminated by the moon, it appeared otherworldly, as if a majestic, shining deity were rising from the sea. Fadalla was the first to see this jet. On moonlit nights, he often climbed to the top of the main mast and kept watch with the same focus he would have had during the day. Although whales could sometimes be spotted at night, very few whalemen would risk lowering a boat for them. So you can imagine the shock and excitement the crew felt when they saw this old oriental figure perched up high at such an unusual hour, his turban illuminated by the moon. After spending his usual time up there without making a sound, his eerie voice suddenly called out, announcing that silvery, moonlit jet. Every sailor sprang to their feet as if a divine spirit had landed among them, shouting, "There she blows!" They were so startled that it felt as if the trump of judgment had sounded, yet they felt no fear, only excitement. Despite the unusual hour, the intensity of the cry was so thrilling that nearly everyone on board instinctively wanted to lower a boat. Walking the deck with quick, determined strides, Ahab ordered the gallant sails and royals to be set and all the stun sails to be unfurled. The best man on the ship had to take the helm. With every mast manned, the ship surged forward before the wind. The strange lift of the breeze filling the sails made the deck feel buoyant, as if it were floating in the air beneath their feet, while the ship raced along as if 2 opposing forces were at play, one trying to reach the heavens, the other pushing towards some distant, horizontal destination. If you had looked at Ahab's face that night, you would have seen a similar conflict within him. As his one good leg echoed energetically on the deck, every step of his wooden leg sounded like a funeral knock. The old man walked between life and death, but despite the ship's swift progress and the eager eyes of the crew searching the water like arrows, the silvery jet was not seen again that night. Every sailor insisted they had seen it once, but never again. This midnight sighting almost faded from memory when, days later, it was spotted again at the same silent hour. Everyone saw it, but when they tried to sail closer, it vanished as if it had never existed. Night after night, it continued to appear and disappear, until no one paid much attention except to marvel at it. Mysteriously emerging in the bright moonlight or starlight, it would vanish for a day, 2 days, or even 3, seemingly always drifting further ahead of them, drawing them in with its solitary spout. According to the sailors' age-old superstitions, some claimed that whenever and wherever it was sighted, regardless of the time or distance, that elusive jet belonged to one single whale, Moby Dick. For a time, there was a peculiar sense of dread surrounding this fleeting sight, as if it were luring them deeper into the ocean for the monster to ambush them in the most remote and savage seas. These fleeting feelings of apprehension, vague yet terrifying, were heightened by the calmness of the weather, which seemed to harbor a sinister charm. For days they traveled through eerily mild seas that appeared devoid of life, as if the ocean itself were trying to resist their vengeful mission. Eventually, as they turned eastward, the Cape winds began howling around them, and the ship rose and fell on the long, turbulent waves. The ivory-tusked Pequod bowed sharply to the wind, slicing through the dark waters in a frenzy, sending showers of foam flying over her sides. The desolate emptiness they had felt was replaced by sights more dismal than before. Strange shapes darted in the water close to the bow, while mysterious sea ravens flew behind them. Each morning, these birds were seen perched on the rigging, and despite the crew's attempts to shoo them away, they stubbornly clung to the lines, as if the ship were a deserted vessel destined for desolation, an appropriate resting place for their homeless selves. The dark sea surged and heaved, as if it were conscious, filled with anguish and remorse for the suffering it had witnessed. Cape of Good Hope, they called it. More like Cape Tormentoso, as it was called in the past, Lured by the deceptive calm that had accompanied them, they found themselves in this tortured sea, where guilty beings seemed transformed into those birds and fish, condemned to swim endlessly without any safe haven or escape from the dark air with no horizon in sight. Yet, calm and unchanging, the solitary jet continued to call them forward. Throughout this stormy chaos, Ahab, though taking almost constant command of the drenched and dangerous deck, displayed a gloomy reserve, speaking to his crew less than ever. In tempestuous times like these, once everything above deck was secured, there was nothing more to do but passively await the storm's outcome. Captain and crew became practical fatalists. Standing for hours with his ivory leg in its usual position and one hand gripping a shroud, Ahab gazed intently into the wind, enduring the sleet or snow that threatened to freeze his eyelashes together. Meanwhile, the crew, forced away from the bow by the crashing waves, formed a line along the bulwarks in the waist of the ship. To better protect themselves from the surging waves, each man slipped into a kind of bowline secured to the rail, swinging like a loosened belt. Few words were exchanged. The silent ship, as if crewed by waxen figures, tore through the raging waves day after day. At night, the same silence reigned among the crew before the ocean's cries. Still wordlessly, the men swung in their bowlines, and Ahab stood resolute against the storm. Even when nature seemed to demand rest, he refused to seek solace in his hammock. Starbuck could never forget the sight of the old man when one night he went down into the cabin to check the barometer. Ahab sat upright in his chair, eyes closed, while rain and half-melted sleet dripped from his unremoved hat and coat. On the table beside him lay an unrolled chart of tides and currents, and his lantern swung from his tightly clenched hand. Although his body was upright, his head was thrown back so that his closed eyes pointed toward the swinging needle of the telltale compass overhead. The cabin compass is called the telltale because it allows the captain to know the ship's course without going to the helm. Terrible old man, thought Starbuck with a shudder. Even in this storm, you steadfastly fix your gaze on your purpose. Chapter 52. The Albatross. Southeast of the Cape, near the distant Crozet Islands, a good spot for right whale hunters, a ship appeared on the horizon, the Goni Albatross by name. As it slowly approached, I could see it clearly from my high position at the foremast. It was a sight that would amaze anyone new to the deep-sea whaling trade. A whaling ship far out at sea, long gone from home. The ship looked bleached like the skeleton of a stranded walrus, as if the ocean waves had washed it clean. Along its sides were streaks of reddish rust, and its masts and rigging looked like frost-covered tree branches. Only the lower sails were up. It was a wild sight, especially the long-bearded lookouts at the tops of the three masts. They looked like they were dressed in animal skins, their clothes torn and patched after almost 4 years at sea. Standing in iron hoops nailed to the mast, they swayed and rocked over the endless sea. When the ship passed close beneath us, we were so near that it felt like we could leap from our mast to theirs. Yet, the worn-out fishermen gazed at us silently, not saying a word to our own lookouts, while a hail from the quarterdeck came from below. "Ship ahoy! Have you seen the white whale?" But as the strange captain leaned over the pale bulwarks and lifted his speaking trumpet to his mouth, it slipped from his hand and fell into the sea. The wind began to pick up, and he struggled in vain to make himself heard without it. Meanwhile, his ship was moving farther away. The crew of the Pequod silently noted this ominous event, happening at the mere mention of the white whale. Ahab paused for a moment, as if he was considering lowering a boat to board the other ship, but the rising wind stopped him. Seizing the opportunity of his upwind position, he grabbed his own trumpet. Seeing that the other ship was a Nantucketer heading home, he called out loudly, "Ahoy there! This is the Pequod, sailing around the world. Tell them to send all future letters to the Pacific Ocean, and in 3 years, if I'm not home, tell them to address them to." At that moment, the wakes of the two ships crossed, and suddenly, in their usual mysterious way, shoals of harmless fish that had been calmly swimming alongside us for days darted away with a shudder, swimming alongside the stranger ship instead. Though Ahab must have seen this kind of thing many times before in his long voyages, for a man as obsessed as he was, even the smallest details could take on special meaning. Swim away from me, do you? Ahab muttered, staring into the water. His words seemed simple, but his tone carried a deeper, helpless sadness, more than the mad old man had ever shown before. But then, turning to the helmsman, who had been holding the ship against the wind to slow her down, Ahab shouted in his old commanding voice, "Up helm! Set her course around the world." Round the world. Those words stir a sense of pride. But where does all that sailing take us? Only through countless dangers, back to the very place we started, where those we left behind have always been ahead of us. If the world were an endless plain, and we could sail eastward forever, discovering new and wondrous places beyond even the islands of myth, then there would be hope in the journey. But when we chase after those distant mysteries we dream of, or pursue the tormenting phantoms that haunt every human heart, we find they lead us in endless circles, or abandon us midway, leaving us lost. Chapter 53. The Gam. The reason Ahab didn't board the whaling ship we had spoken to was the weather. Both the wind and sea hinted at an upcoming storm. But even without that, based on how he acted in similar situations later, he likely wouldn't have boarded anyway. If he didn't get any useful information from a ship when hailing it, he wasn't interested in wasting time with its captain, not even for a brief chat. To understand this, it's important to explain the usual customs of whaling ships when they meet in far-off seas, especially in common hunting grounds. Imagine two strangers meeting in a desolate area like the Pine Barrens of New York or the Salisbury Plain in England. In such lonely places, it would be hard for them not to greet each other, exchange news, and maybe even sit down for a rest together. Now think about two whaling ships crossing paths in the vast, empty seas, whether near remote islands like Fanning's Island or King's Mills. It's even more natural for these ships to not only hail each other, but to come together for a more sociable meeting. This is especially true when the ships come from the same port, with captains and crew members who might know each other and have personal news to share. For a ship that's been out at sea for a long time, an outbound vessel might carry letters, or at the very least, it might have newspapers that are a year or two more recent than the old worn ones the ship has on board. In return, the outbound ship would get the latest whaling news from the area, which is incredibly important. This kind of exchange is common between whaling ships, even if both have been away from home for a long time. One of them might have picked up letters from another ship far away, and some of those letters might be for the ship it just met. Along with news, the crews would enjoy a friendly conversation, sharing a bond over their shared profession and the hardships they endure together. Even if the ships are from different countries, as long as they speak the same language, like Americans and Englishmen, they usually get along. Although English whalers are fewer in number, and when they do meet American whalers, there can be a bit of awkwardness. The English tend to be more reserved, and Americans don't really appreciate that kind of attitude in anyone but themselves. Plus, English whalers sometimes act like they're superior to American ones, viewing the lean, rugged Nantucketers with their unique quirks as something like country bumpkins. But it's hard to see where that sense of superiority comes from, considering that Americans collectively kill more whales in one day than the English do in 10 years. Still, the Nantucketers don't take it personally, probably because they know they have their own quirks too. So, whalers are generally the most sociable of all ships. While some merchant ships might pass each other in the middle of the Atlantic without so much as a greeting, like two snobby dandies on Broadway, whalers almost always stop to chat. Men of war ships go through elaborate, almost ridiculous formalities when they meet, with lots of bowing and lowering of flags, which doesn't exactly scream genuine goodwill. Slave ships are usually in such a rush that they avoid each other entirely. And pirates? Well, when pirates meet, they just ask each other, "How many skulls?" Much like whalers ask, "How many barrels?" Once that question's answered, they quickly part ways because they don't like seeing too much of their own kind. But whalers, they're honest, humble, friendly, and sociable. When they meet in decent weather, they have what's called a gam, a type of meeting so unique to whalers that other sailors don't even know the word for it. And if they hear about it, they just laugh and make jokes about blubber boilers and spouters. It's strange that merchant seamen, pirates, men of war sailors, and slave ship crews all look down on whalers, considering that none of their jobs are particularly glamorous. Pirates, for instance, might end up elevated, but only at the gallows, and even then, it's not a very solid kind of elevation. But what exactly is a gam? You won't find the word in any dictionary, not in Dr. Johnson's or even Noah Webster's, but it's been in regular use among about 15,000 Yankees for many years. So let me define it. Gam. Noun. A social meeting between two or more whaling ships, usually on a hunting ground, where after hailing each other, they exchange visits. The captains stay on one ship while the chief mates visit the other. There's one more thing about gamming that's worth mentioning. Every profession has its own quirks, and whaling is no exception. On pirate ships, men of war, or slave ships, when a captain is rowed somewhere, he sits comfortably in the stern, sometimes on a cushioned seat, and often steers with a little fancy tiller decorated with ribbons. But in a whaleboat, there's no seat, no cushioned spot, and no tiller. Whaling captains aren't wheeled around like old aldermen. Instead, during a gam, the boat's steerer or harpooner takes the helm, while the captain stands, balancing himself like a tree. Conscious of the attention of both ships' crews, he tries to maintain his dignity, keeping his hands in his pockets, even though the boat's steering oar occasionally knocks him in the back and the after oar hits his knees. Still, he stands tall, because it would never do for him to be seen steadying himself by grabbing onto anything, not with everyone watching. However, there have been a few times, in a sudden squall, where a captain has been known to grab the nearest oarsman's hair and hold on for dear life. Chapter 54. The Town Ho's Story, as told at the Golden Inn. The Cape of Good Hope and the vast ocean surrounding it is much like a busy crossroads where you meet more travelers than in any other place. Not long after encountering the Ghani, we met another homeward-bound whaling ship, the Town Ho, which was mostly crewed by Polynesians. During the brief meeting we had, they shared some significant news about Moby Dick. For some, the general interest in the white whale became even more intense due to a strange event related to the Town Ho's story. It seemed to involve some sort of divine judgment, as people sometimes believe happens to certain individuals. This part of the story, kept secret, was never shared with Captain Ahab or his officers. It was known only to 3 white sailors aboard the Town Ho. One of them told Tashtego, but under a vow of secrecy. However, Tashtego talked about it in his sleep, revealing enough that when he was woken up, he couldn't hold back the rest of the story. This secret had a powerful effect on those aboard the Pequod who learned of it, but they kept it quiet, never letting it reach the captain or the crew beyond the mainmast. Now, I'll intertwine this secret with the story that was publicly told and record the entire strange affair. The old whaler's cry when first spotting a whale from the lookout is still used in the hunt for the famous Galapagos tortoise. For fun, I will tell this story in the same style I once did in Lima, to a relaxed circle of my Spanish friends, on a Saint's Eve while we smoked in the grand, gold-tiled courtyard of the Golden Inn. My closest friends there were the young noblemen, Don Pedro and Don Sebastian, who would occasionally ask questions, and I answered them as we went along. 2 years before I first heard the events I am about to tell you, gentlemen, the Town Ho, a sperm whaler from Nantucket, was sailing here in the Pacific, just a few days' journey east of this very Golden Inn. She was north of the equator when, one morning, as they checked the pumps as usual, they noticed the ship was taking on more water than usual. They thought a swordfish had punctured the hull. But the captain, believing he would have good luck in that area, was reluctant to leave, especially since the leak didn't seem too serious. Even after searching the hold as low as they couldn't find the source of the leak, so the ship continued cruising with the sailors working the pumps at regular intervals. But luck did not favor them, and the leak gradually worsened. Eventually, the captain decided to head for the nearest harbor among the islands to have the ship repaired. Though the journey would be long, the captain wasn't too worried. His pumps were top quality, and with 36 men on board taking turns, they could easily keep the ship from flooding. In fact, if they had experienced good winds the entire way, they likely would have made it safely without any disasters, if not for the cruel and arrogant first mate, Radney, from Martha's Vineyard, and the desperate revenge of Steelkilt, a lakeman from Buffalo. Lakeman? Buffalo? What's a lakeman, and where is Buffalo? Asked Don Sebastian, sitting up from his grass hammock. Buffalo is on the eastern shore of Lake Erie, Don. You'll hear more about all that soon. Now, gentlemen, picture this. In square-rigged ships as large and strong as any that sail from your old Callao to far-off Manila, this lakeman, from the inland heart of America, had grown up with the same sense of adventure and danger as any man raised by the ocean. Those vast freshwater lakes of ours, Erie, Ontario, Huron, Superior, and Michigan, are as expansive as the ocean and share many of its finest qualities. They have islands, are bordered by two great nations, and provide long routes for trade and naval activity. The shores are lined with ancient forests and dotted with cities like Buffalo and Cleveland, as well as native villages. Ships of all kinds sail these waters, and they know the fury of storms as violent as any found at sea. Steelkilt, though an inland man, was born and raised with the wild spirit of the ocean, and Radney, while raised by the sea, was just as spiteful and argumentative as a backwoodsman from the frontier. But even though Radney had some decent qualities, and Steelkilt, despite his wild nature, could have been controlled with firm yet fair treatment, Radney was doomed. Steelkilt knew it too. It was only a day or two after they set course for the island port that the leak started getting worse, requiring about an hour of pumping each day. Now, you should know that in well-traveled seas like the Atlantic, captains sometimes don't mind pumping their way across the ocean, though it's risky. And even in the lonely and wild seas far to the west, it's not unusual for ships to pump continuously for long voyages, as long as there's a coast nearby or a safe retreat. But when a ship is far from land and the leak starts getting worse, the captain might begin to worry. That's how things were for the Town Ho. When the leak grew worse again, some of the crew, especially Radney, became anxious. He ordered the sails raised and adjusted to catch every bit of wind. Now, Radney wasn't a coward, and he wasn't usually concerned about his own safety, so some sailors thought his concern was only because he partly owned the ship. That evening, while working the pumps, the crew was making jokes, even as they stood ankle-deep in the clear water flowing from the pumps and spilling out through the scuppers. Now, as you know, it often happens that when someone in charge finds one of their subordinates to be more proud or capable, they develop a dislike for that person. They'll try to tear down their rival's status. Whether that's true or not, Steelkilt was a tall, proud man, with a face like a Roman and a golden beard like a lion's mane. If he had been born into royalty, he could have been a great king. Radney, on the other hand, was ugly, stubborn, and cruel. He hated Steelkilt, and Steelkilt knew it. When the mate approached while Steelkilt was working at the pump, the lakeman pretended not to notice him and kept up his jokes. "Ah, this is quite a leak, boys. Someone grab a jug so we can have a taste. It's worth bottling. I bet Radney's going to have to cut off a piece of the ship and tow it home. It's not just swordfish causing this. There's a whole team of ship carpenters working away at the bottom. If Radney were here, I'd tell him to dive in and chase them off. They're ruining his investment. But he's a simple soul, Radney, and quite the looker, too. I wonder if he'd give a poor man like me a model of his nose." "What the hell? Why did the pump stop?" yelled Radney, pretending not to hear the jokes. "Get it going again." "Aye, aye, sir," Steelkilt replied, as cheerful as ever. "Come on, boys, keep it moving." And with that, the pump clanged louder than ever, and the men threw themselves into the task, working as hard as they could. Afterward, exhausted, Steelkilt sat down on the windlass, his face red, eyes bloodshot, and wiping sweat from his brow. Why Radney chose that moment to provoke him, I don't know. But striding across the deck, the mate ordered Steelkilt to get a broom and clean the deck, and also to grab a shovel to deal with the mess left by a pig that had been allowed to roam free. Now, gentlemen, sweeping a ship's deck is something that is done every evening, except in the worst weather. It's such a part of sea life that even ships about to sink have been known to do it. It's usually the boys' job if there are any aboard. Also, the men on the town hoe were divided into groups to take turns working the pumps, and Steelkilt, being the strongest, was in charge of one of those groups. That meant he shouldn't have had to do any other work that wasn't related to running the ship, just like his fellow sailors. I mention all these details so you can fully understand the situation between these two men. Radney's command about the shovel wasn't just an order. It was clearly meant to humiliate and insult Steelkilt, almost like spitting in his face. Anyone who sailed on a whaling ship would understand this, and Steelkilt certainly did. As he sat there, staring into Radney's angry eyes, he could sense the tension building, like a slow-burning fuse heading toward an explosion. Despite the insult, Steelkilt, being a man of strong character, didn't immediately react. Brave men like him, even when provoked, often have a strange instinct to hold back when dealing with angry people. So in a calm but slightly exhausted voice, he told Radney that sweeping the deck wasn't his job, and he wouldn't do it. He didn't even mention the shovel, but pointed to 3 young men who normally handled the sweeping and who hadn't done much all day. Radney, furious, cursed at him and repeated the order, now stepping toward Steelkilt with a cooper's hammer he'd grabbed nearby. Steelkilt, tired from working the pumps, was already frustrated, and Radney's behavior only made it worse. But he still managed to keep his anger in check, staying seated and silent. Radney got even closer, shaking the hammer right in Steelkilt's face and yelling at him to follow orders. Finally, Steelkilt stood up and began to back away around the windlass, with Radney still following him, hammer in hand. Steelkilt calmly repeated that he wouldn't obey. When it became clear that Radney wouldn't back down, Steelkilt gave him a silent warning, gesturing for him to stop. But Radney ignored it, and the two circled the windlass until Steelkilt decided he'd had enough. He stopped by the hatch and said firmly, "Mr. Radney, I'm not going to obey you. Put that hammer down, or you'll regret it." But Radney, too angry to listen, brought the hammer even closer to Steelkilt's face, cursing him. Steelkilt didn't flinch, staring him down. With his right hand clenched behind him, Steelkilt warned Radney that if the hammer so much as touched his cheek, he would kill him. But Radney, not knowing when to stop, swung the hammer. It grazed Steelkilt's cheek, and in an instant, Steelkilt punched him so hard that his jaw was crushed, and he fell to the deck, bleeding like a wounded whale. Before anyone could react, Steelkilt was already climbing a backstay to where 2 of his fellow sailors, canalers, were stationed. At this point, Don Pedro, one of the listeners, interrupted, asking about the canalers, since he had never heard of them. The storyteller explained that canalers were men who worked on the Erie Canal, a major waterway in New York. These men lived rough, lawless lives, surrounded by both wild nature and civilized towns. Their tough lifestyle on the canal often led them to become sailors, including on whaling ships, where they gained a reputation for being wild and unruly. Steelkilt's canaler friends quickly joined the fight, and a group of other sailors also tried to help. A chaotic struggle erupted on the deck, with the captain shouting for the officers to subdue Steelkilt and his men. But Steelkilt and his comrades managed to barricade themselves behind some casks near the windlass. The captain, now armed with 2 pistols, threatened them, calling them pirates and ordering them to surrender. Steelkilt, standing on the barricade, defied him, warning that if he were killed, the rest of the crew would mutiny. The captain hesitated, unsure if Steelkilt's threat was serious, but continued to demand that they return to work. Steelkilt then asked if they'd be safe from punishment if they obeyed. The captain refused to make any promises, only repeating his order to get back to work. Steelkilt, along with his comrades, stood firm, declaring that they wouldn't lift a finger unless the captain swore not to punish them. After a tense standoff, the captain finally ordered them to go below deck, where he locked them in the forecastle. The next 3 days passed with the mutineers refusing to work and being given minimal food and water. On the 4th day, 4 of the men, worn out and desperate, gave in and returned to work. The rest, including Steelkilt, held out. By the 5th day, 3 more men surrendered, leaving only Steelkilt and 2 others still defiant. "Ready to get back to work now?" asked the captain with a mocking sneer. "Lock us up again, will you?" Steelkilt shouted. "Oh, of course," said the captain, and the key turned. It was at this moment, gentlemen, that Steelkilt, furious from being betrayed by 7 of his former allies, enraged by the captain's taunting voice, and driven mad by the long, dark imprisonment, proposed to the 2 canallers, who up to this point seemed to share his sentiments, that they break free the next time the guards summoned them. Armed with their sharp, mincing knives, long, heavy, crescent-shaped blades with handles at both ends, they would storm the ship from the front to the back, and if driven by desperation, they might even take over the ship. He swore that he would do it, whether they joined him or not. This, he said, would be his last night in that hole. The other 2 didn't oppose the plan. They swore they were ready for anything except surrender. In fact, they both insisted on being the first ones on deck when the attack came. But Steelkilt objected fiercely, claiming that right for himself, especially since neither of his comrades would back down, and only one could be the first up the ladder. Only one man at a time could climb it. And here, gentlemen, is where their treachery comes to light. Upon hearing their leader's plan, each of the canallers, in his own mind, thought of the same betrayal, to be the first out of the hole, not to attack, but to surrender and try to earn a small chance of pardon. When Steelkilt made it clear he intended to lead them to the very end, they secretly conspired and, while their leader slept, bound him with ropes and gagged him. At midnight, they screamed for the captain. Thinking a murder was underway, the captain and his armed crew rushed to the forecastle. In minutes, the hatch was opened and Steelkilt, still struggling but tied hand and foot, was pushed up by his treacherous companions, who immediately claimed credit for capturing a man who was supposedly ready to commit murder. But the captain didn't reward them. Instead, all 3 were seized, dragged along the deck like dead animals, and tied to the mizzen rigging. There they hung like slabs of meat until morning. "Curse you," the captain shouted, pacing in front of them. "Even the vultures wouldn't touch you, you scoundrels." At sunrise, the captain called the crew together. Separating those who had rebelled from those who hadn't, he told the mutineers that he had half a mind to flog them all, and that maybe he should, for justice's sake. But for now, because they had surrendered, he'd let them off with a harsh reprimand, which he promptly delivered. "But as for you," he said, turning to the 3 men hanging in the rigging, "I intend to cut you into pieces for the trypots." He grabbed a rope and whipped the 2 traitors until they slumped lifelessly, like the 2 thieves crucified with Christ. "You've sprained my wrist," he shouted, "but there's still enough rope left for you, you stubborn fool." He ordered the gag to be removed from Steelkilt's mouth. "Let's hear what you have to say." For a moment, the exhausted man moved his cramped jaws, then turned his head and hissed, "What I say is this: if you flog me, I will kill you." "Is that so? You think you can scare me?" said the captain, preparing to strike. "You'd better not," Steelkilt hissed. "I have to," said the captain, raising the rope again. Steelkilt hissed something else, only loud enough for the captain to hear. To everyone's shock, the captain stepped back, paced the deck a few times, then threw down the rope and said, "I won't do it. Let him go. Cut him down." As the mates moved to carry out the order, a pale man with a bandaged head stopped them, Radney, the chief mate. Since Steelkilt had hit him, he'd been confined to his bed, but hearing the commotion on deck, he had come to see what was happening. His mouth was so swollen he could barely speak, but he mumbled something about being ready to do what the captain wouldn't dare. He grabbed the rope and moved toward Steelkilt. "You're a coward," hissed Steelkilt. "Yes, I am. But take this." Radney swung the rope at him, ignoring whatever threat Steelkilt had made. The 3 men were then cut down, and all hands returned to their work. Though the crew was moody, they sullenly resumed their duties at the pumps. Later that evening, when one of the watches had gone below deck, a commotion broke out in the forecastle. The 2 traitors, trembling with fear, ran to the captain's cabin, begging for protection from the rest of the crew. Despite being kicked and ordered to leave, they insisted, so they were locked in the ship's hold for safety. Surprisingly, no further mutiny arose. On the contrary, it seemed that, at Steelkilt's suggestion, the crew had decided to maintain strict order, obeying all commands until they reached port, where they planned to desert the ship. However, to shorten the voyage, they agreed not to alert the captain if any whales were sighted, even though the leaking ship still had lookouts at the mastheads, and the captain remained eager to chase whales as if it were the first day of the voyage. Radney, despite his bandaged mouth, was just as willing to go after whales. But although Steelkilt convinced the crew to be passive, he kept his own plans of revenge against Radney secret. Steelkilt was part of Radney's watch, and as if Radney sought to hasten his fate, he insisted on resuming his duties at night, despite the captain's warnings. Steelkilt used this opportunity to scheme. Radney had a habit of sitting on the ship's bulwarks at night, leaning his arm on the gunwale of a boat hoisted just above the waterline. It was known that he sometimes dozed off in this position. Steelkilt carefully braided something in his spare time and waited for his next shift at the helm, which would come at 2 a.m. on the third night since his betrayal. His plan was set. He would strike when Radney was most vulnerable. One night, as Steelkilt tucked his coat into his hammock, an iron ball, carefully netted, rolled out of his jacket pocket. 24 hours later, during his shift at the helm, he was ready to act. But fate intervened. A fool of a sailor, during his watch at dawn, suddenly shouted, "There she rolls! There she rolls!" It was Moby Dick. "Moby Dick?" cried Don Sebastian. "What's this Moby Dick?" "A legendary, deadly white whale," the sailor explained. "But that's a long story. Tell us more," urged the others. "Not now," the sailor replied. "Let me finish my story." With the excitement of seeing the whale, the crew forgot their pact of silence. Soon, the entire ship was frenzied, chasing after the famous white whale. As the crew prepared to hunt, Steelkilt remained calm, but focused on his revenge. When the boats were lowered, Radney's boat led the chase. Steelkilt rowed furiously, following Radney's orders. Their harpooner struck the whale, and Radney prepared to lance it. But as they closed in, the boat was overturned, and Radney was thrown onto the whale's back. In the chaos, Radney was tossed into the sea, where Moby Dick seized him in its jaws and dragged him under. Though Steelkilt had the chance to save him, he did nothing. Moby Dick disappeared, and the crew gave chase but couldn't catch the whale. Eventually, the ship reached a desolate port, where most of the crew deserted, led by Steelkilt. The remaining crew, too few to sail the ship, worked with local islanders to repair the vessel. The captain, unable to trust his new allies, sailed to Tahiti to recruit more men. Days later, while at sea, the captain encountered Steelkilt and his men in a war canoe. Steelkilt demanded that the captain beach his boat on a nearby island for 6 days. After a tense exchange, the captain complied, and Steelkilt and his men sailed away, eventually escaping to France. No one knows where Steelkilt is now, but Radney's widow still dreams of the white whale that killed her husband. "Is that the end?" asked Don Sebastian. "Yes, Don." "Is this story true?" asked one of the gentlemen. "It's so unbelievable." "Did you witness it?" The sailor swore on the holy book, confirming the truth of his story. "Ready to work now?" the captain asked with a cruel sneer. "Lock us up again, will you?" shouted Steelkilt. "Of course," the captain said, locking the door. At this moment, furious at the betrayal of 7 of his old comrades, angered by the mocking voice, and driven mad by his long imprisonment in a place as dark as despair itself, Steelkilt proposed to the 2 canalers, who so far had agreed with him, that they break out during the next call. Armed with their sharp mincing knives, long, crescent-shaped weapons with handles on both ends, they would storm the ship and, if desperate enough, seize control of it. He declared he would do this alone if necessary, but it would be the last night he spent in that wretched hole. His 2 companions didn't argue. They swore they were ready for anything but surrender. They even insisted on being the first on deck when the time came. However, Steelkilt fiercely objected, reserving the honor for himself. Neither would give way to the other, and only one could fit through the ladder at a time. It was here that the treachery of these men became clear. Both of them, secretly planning the same betrayal, wanted to be the first out so they could surrender and secure whatever chance of pardon that might bring. When Steelkilt insisted on leading, they somehow communicated their shared plan, and when he dozed off, they tied him up, gagged him, and screamed for the captain at midnight. Thinking a murder was happening, the captain and his armed crew rushed to the forecastle. In no time, they opened the hatch, and the bound and struggling Steelkilt was pushed up into the air by his deceitful allies, who then claimed the glory of capturing a man they said was ready to kill. But all three were dragged along the deck like dead weight and hung side by side on the mizzen rigging like slaughtered animals, left there until morning. "The vultures wouldn't even touch you," cursed the captain as he paced before them. At sunrise, the captain gathered the crew, separating the rebels from the others. He told the rebels he felt like flogging them all, that he should do it for the sake of justice. But considering their surrender, he'd let them off with a harsh scolding, which he promptly gave. "As for you, you treacherous scum," he said to the three men hanging from the rigging, "I plan to chop you up for the trypots." Grabbing a rope, he lashed the two traitors until they hung limp like lifeless bodies. "My wrist is sprained from whipping you," he said at last, "but there's enough strength left for you," he added, turning to Steelkilt. "Take that gag off his mouth and let's hear what he has to say." Steelkilt, exhausted, barely moved his jaw. He twisted his head painfully and in a hoarse whisper said, "If you flog me, I will kill you." "Is that so? Let's see how you scare me," the captain said, raising the rope again. "You'd better not," Steelkilt hissed. "I have to," the captain replied, drawing back the rope for another blow. Steelkilt whispered something only the captain could hear. To everyone's shock, the captain stepped back, paced the deck a few times, and suddenly threw down the rope. "I won't do it. Let him go. Cut him down," he ordered. As the junior officers rushed to follow the order, Radney, the first mate, a pale man with a bandaged head, stopped them. Radney had been bedridden since Steelkilt struck him, but hearing the commotion, he had come on deck to witness the scene. Barely able to speak, he mumbled something about being willing and able to do what the captain wouldn't, and he snatched the rope. "You coward," Steelkilt hissed. "Yes, I am, but take this," Radney replied, striking Steelkilt despite his threats. The three men were finally cut down, and all hands returned to their work. That evening, after dark, a commotion erupted in the forecastle. The two traitors, terrified, ran to the captain's cabin, begging for protection from the rest of the crew. They were so scared they couldn't be sent back, so the captain locked them in the ship's run. Despite the chaos, no more signs of mutiny appeared. In fact, under Steelkilt's influence, the crew decided to keep the peace, obey all orders, and desert the ship once they reached port. But they also agreed to one more thing: to never shout out if they saw a whale, hoping this would speed up the voyage. Though Steelkilt kept his plans for personal revenge to himself, he was in Radney's night watch, and Radney, stubborn as ever, insisted on leading the watch despite the captain's warning. This played right into Steelkilt's hands, and he began quietly preparing for his revenge. Radney had a habit of sitting on the ship's bulwarks at night, often dozing off. There was a gap between the ship and the sea below, and Steelkilt timed everything perfectly. 3 days after being betrayed, his turn at the helm came around at 2 a.m., and during his off-watch, he braided something carefully. "What are you making?" asked a shipmate. "What does it look like?" Steelkilt asked. "A lanyard for your bag, but it looks odd." "Yeah, a bit odd," Steelkilt said, holding it up. "But it'll do. I'm out of twine. Do you have any?" There wasn't any, so Steelkilt went to Radney for some. "Why ask him?" a sailor said. "Why not? He'll help if it benefits him," Steelkilt replied. Radney gave him the twine, but it was never seen again. The next night, a small iron ball rolled out of Steelkilt's jacket as he tucked it under his hammock. 24 hours later, his turn at the helm arrived, and in Steelkilt's mind, Radney was already dead, his skull crushed. But fate intervened. Just before dawn, a sailor drawing water suddenly shouted, "There she blows! There she blows! Moby Dick!" Forgetting their pact, the crew erupted in chaos at the sight of the great white whale. Radney, leading his boat in the chase, stood on the bow ready to strike. But in the chaos, Radney was thrown from the boat and into the water, where Moby Dick seized him in his jaws, ending his life. In the meantime, when the boat first hit the water, Steelkilt loosened the line to drift away from the whirlpool. He calmly watched, lost in his own thoughts. But a sudden, violent tug on the boat made him quickly grab his knife and cut the line, freeing the whale. In the distance, Moby Dick resurfaced, with shreds of Radney's red woolen shirt caught in his teeth. All 4 boats gave chase again, but the whale evaded them and disappeared for good. Eventually, the town-ho reached a remote, wild port, inhabited only by savages. Led by Steelkilt, all but 5 or 6 of the crew abandoned ship, hiding among the palm trees. They later stole a large war canoe from the natives and sailed off to find another harbor. With the crew reduced to a few men, the captain asked the islanders for help with repairing the ship's leak. However, the small group of remaining sailors had to watch the islanders constantly, night and day, fearing treachery. The work was so exhausting that by the time the ship was ready to sail, the crew was too weak to handle such a large vessel. After consulting with his officers, the captain anchored the ship far from shore, loaded his 2 cannons, stacked muskets on the deck, and warned the islanders to stay away or face the consequences. Then, he and 1 man set sail in a whaleboat for Tahiti, 500 miles away, to find more men. On the 4th day of their journey, they spotted a large canoe near a coral island. The captain steered away from it, but the canoe chased them. Soon, Steelkilt's voice called out, demanding the captain stop or be rammed. The captain drew his pistol, but Steelkilt, standing with 1 foot on each of the 2 canoes tied together, mocked him, saying if the pistol even clicked, he would sink the boat in foam and bubbles. "What do you want from me?" the captain shouted. "Where are you headed, and why?" Steelkilt demanded. "I'm going to Tahiti for more men." "Good. Let me board for a moment. I mean no harm." Steelkilt then jumped into the water, swam to the boat, and climbed aboard to face the captain. "Cross your arms and lift your head. Now repeat after me. As soon as Steelkilt leaves, I swear to beach this boat on that island and stay there for 6 days. If I don't, may lightning strike me." "A good student," Steelkilt laughed. "Goodbye, sir." Then he jumped back into the sea and swam to the canoes. Steelkilt watched until the captain's boat was beached and pulled up under the coconut trees. Then he set sail again and eventually reached Tahiti. There, he found 2 ships about to sail for France, and they happened to need exactly the number of men Steelkilt had. He and his men boarded, leaving their former captain behind, far from any chance of revenge. About 10 days after the French ships sailed, the captain arrived in his whaleboat and had to recruit some Tahitians who were somewhat familiar with the sea. He rented a small schooner, returned to his ship, and resumed his journey. As for where Steelkilt is now, no one knows. But in Nantucket, Radney's widow still looks out to the sea that refuses to return her husband. In her dreams, she still sees the terrifying white whale that killed him. "Are you finished?" Don Sebastian quietly asked. "I am, Don." "Then tell me, honestly, do you believe this story is really true? It's so extraordinary. Did you get it from a reliable source? Forgive me if I seem too curious." "Yes, please, bear with us," said the rest of the group eagerly. "Do you have a Bible here in the Golden Inn, gentlemen?" "No," Don Sebastian replied, "but I know a priest nearby who can bring one. I'll go get it." "But are you sure you want to go this far?" "Please also bring the priest," the sailor requested. "As there are no more inquisitions in Lima," one man whispered to another, "I fear our sailor friend is risking trouble with the church." "Excuse me, Don Sebastian," the sailor added, "but could you also make sure to get the largest Bible you can find?" A short time later, Don Sebastian returned with a tall, solemn priest carrying the Bible. "Let me take off my hat. Father, hold the holy book before me so I can touch it." "So help me God, and on my honor, the story I've told you, gentlemen, is true in its most important details. I know it because it happened on this earth. I was on that ship. I knew the crew. I've seen and spoken with Steelkilt since Radney's death." Chapter 55. Of the Monstrous Pictures of Whales. Soon, I'll try to describe the true shape of a whale as seen by whalers, as well as anyone can without using a canvas. But before that, it's worth addressing the strange and inaccurate images of whales that people still believe in today. It's time to correct these misconceptions by proving such pictures are completely wrong. The source of these artistic errors may go back to the ancient sculptures of the Hindus, Egyptians, and Greeks. From those early days, when dolphins were depicted on temple walls, statues, shields, coins, and medallions in armor, like a knight's and with helmeted heads, similar creative liberties have been taken with images of whales, even in scientific representations. The oldest known portrait of a whale can be found in the ancient cavern temple of Elephanta in India. The Brahmins say that all human trades and activities were foretold in the carvings of that temple long before they ever existed. So, It's no surprise that whaling is hinted at there too. One carving shows an incarnation of the god Vishnu as a leviathan known as the Matsya avatar. But while the sculpture shows a half-man, half-whale figure, the whale's tail looks more like a snake's than the wide flukes of a real whale. If you visit old art galleries, you'll see that even famous Christian artists failed in their attempts to paint whales. Take Guido's painting of Perseus saving Andromeda from a sea monster or whale. Where did Guido come up with that strange creature? And Hogarth, in his own painting of the same scene, doesn't do any better. His whale is huge and bloated, barely touching the water's surface, with a mouth so large it looks like a gate. Then there are the whales, shown in old books like the one by the Scottish naturalist Sibbald, or the biblical depictions of Jonah's whale in early Bibles. These aren't much better. And the decorative whale seen wrapped around anchors on old book covers, though called a dolphin, is clearly meant to resemble a whale. This design was introduced by an Italian publisher in the 15th century during the Renaissance, a time when people thought dolphins were related to the Leviathan. Even in older books, you'll find strange and imaginative takes on whales, showing them surrounded by fountains of water spouting from their heads. The title page of Francis Bacon's The Advancement of Learning has some particularly curious whales. But let's leave behind these amateur attempts and look at supposedly serious scientific drawings of whales. In Harris's collection of voyages, for example, there are plates taken from a Dutch book about a whaling expedition in 1671. One of the illustrations shows whales lying among icebergs, with polar bears walking on their backs. Another shows the whale's tail positioned incorrectly, straight up and down. In A Voyage Round Cape Horn, written by Captain Colnett of the British Navy, there's a drawing of a sperm whale supposedly based on one killed off the coast of Mexico in 1793. This whale has an eye that, if you apply the scale given, would be 5 feet wide. You can't help but wonder why the captain didn't go ahead and show Jonah peeking out of that enormous eye. Even in books intended for young readers, like the 1807 London edition of Goldsmith's Animated Nature, there are comical mistakes. The whale in that book looks more like a pig, and the narwhal is drawn so strangely, it's hard to believe anyone could take it seriously. In 1825, the French naturalist Bernard Germain, Count de Lacépède, published a book with pictures of different whale species, but even these are incorrect. One picture of a right whale was so wrong that even the experienced whaler Scoresby said it didn't match anything in nature. The worst offender, though, might be Frederick Cuvier, brother of the famous Baron Cuvier. In 1836, he published A Natural History of Whales, with a picture of a sperm whale that's so bad it looks more like a squash than a whale. He clearly never went whaling, and it's unclear where he even got the idea for that drawing. Maybe from a Chinese vase. Then there are the whales painted on the signs outside oil shops. These whales often look like something out of a nightmare, with dromedary humps and massive jaws that seem ready to devour sailors by the boatload. These pictures flounder in a sea of blood and blue paint, and are about as accurate as the others. Still, it's not entirely surprising that so many artists get the whale wrong. After all, most of the drawings have been based on dead whales washed up on shore. These are as accurate as trying to represent a grand ship from a picture of its wreckage. While elephants can be sketched in their full glory, no one has ever fully captured the living whale in all its majesty at sea. In the water, most of the whale's enormous bulk is hidden, and no one has ever managed to lift a whale out of the ocean to accurately capture its true form. Some might think the whale's skeleton could give clues about its shape, but that's not the case either. A whale's bones give little idea of its overall form. As the naturalist Hunter once said, a whale's skeleton is like an insect's chrysalis, far from resembling the living creature. This is especially true of the whale's head, as I'll show later in this book. The bones of its fin, for example, are very similar to human hand bones, minus the thumb. The whale essentially has 4 fingers permanently encased in its fleshy fin, like human fingers inside a glove. As Stubb humorously put it, the whale may rough us up, but at least he's always wearing mittens. In the end, the great whale may be the one creature in the world that will never be painted accurately. Some portraits may come close, but none will ever capture its true form. So, the only way to get a good idea of what a whale really looks like is to go whaling yourself. But doing that comes with the very real risk of being smashed and sunk by the whale. So maybe it's best not to be too curious about the Leviathan after all. Chapter 56. Of the less erroneous pictures of whales and the true pictures of whaling scenes. When it comes to the exaggerated depictions of whales, I'm tempted to dive into the equally exaggerated stories about them found in both old and modern books, especially in works by writers like Pliny, Purchas, Hakluyt, Harris, and Cuvier. But I'll skip that for now. I'm aware of only 4 published drawings of the great sperm whale, those by Colnet, Huggins, Frederick Cuvier, and Beale. I've already mentioned Colnet and Cuvier in the previous chapter. Huggins's drawings are better than theirs, but Beale's are by far the best. All of Beale's depictions of the whale are well done, except for the middle figure in his image of 3 whales in different poses in his second chapter. His frontispiece, showing boats attacking sperm whales, might raise some doubts for those unfamiliar with whaling, but it's impressively accurate and lifelike overall. Some of J. Ross Brown's sperm whale drawings capture the whale's shape quite well, but the engravings themselves are poorly executed, though that's not his fault. For the right whale, the best outlines come from Scoresby, but they're too small to leave a strong impression. He only has 1 picture of a whaling scene, which is unfortunate because well-done images are the best way to get a realistic sense of what the living whale looks like when seen by the whalers. All in all, the most impressive, though not entirely accurate, depictions of whales and whaling scenes are found in 2 large French engravings taken from paintings by Garnery. These images show attacks on both the sperm and right whales. In the first engraving, a powerful sperm whale is portrayed in full grandeur, having just surfaced beneath a boat, tossing the wreckage high into the air. The front of the boat is barely intact and is shown balanced on the whale's spine, with an oarsman standing in the prow, shrouded in the whale's spout, leaping as if from a cliff. The action is captured brilliantly. Floating nearby is an empty line tub, and scattered in the water are the heads of the swimming crew, their faces filled with terror, while in the distance, the ship is approaching the chaotic scene. The whale's anatomy might not be perfect, but I can't say I'd be able to draw it any better. In the second engraving, a boat is shown drawing close to the barnacle-covered side of a large right whale, which rolls in the water like a mossy boulder from the Patagonian cliffs. The whale's spouts are thick, black, and heavy, almost as if a hearty meal is being prepared in the belly below. Seabirds are pecking at the small creatures on the whale's back, and all the while, the massive whale is rushing through the water, creating foamy waves in its wake, causing the small boat to rock as if it's been caught near the paddles of a large steamship. The foreground is filled with chaotic motion, but in the background, the sea is calm and still, the ship's sails drooping in the motionless air, and a dead whale floats lifeless, conquered, with a flag of victory hanging lazily from the spout hole. I don't know who Garnery the painter is or was, but I'd bet my life that he was either an expert on whaling or had been extensively taught by someone who was. The French have a knack for painting action scenes. If you look at all the paintings in Europe, you won't find a gallery that captures the liveliness of action, like the Hall of Battles at Versailles, where you can almost feel the clash of France's great battles. Swords gleaming like flashes of lightning, and kings and emperors charging by like a cavalry of centaurs. Garnery's sea battles deserve a spot in that gallery. The French have a unique ability to capture the dramatic essence of scenes, and their paintings and engravings of whaling reflect that. Despite having far less experience with whaling than the English or Americans, the French have produced the only detailed sketches that convey the true spirit of the whale hunt. The English and American artists, by comparison, seem content with basic outlines, like the profile of a whale, which is as artistically interesting as the outline of a pyramid. Even Scoresby, the famous right whale expert, after giving us a stiff, full-body picture of a Greenland whale and a few small sketches of narwhals and porpoises, shifts to detailed engravings of whaling tools like boat hooks and harpoons. He even gives us magnified images of Arctic snow crystals with the precision of a Leeuwenhoek, as if he was determined to show the world every crystal in extreme detail. I don't mean to criticize the great explorer, I respect him, but in such an important subject, it was certainly an oversight not to get each crystal's authenticity verified by a Greenland official. Besides Garnery's engravings, there are two more French engravings worth mentioning by someone named H. Durand. One of these, though not directly related to our topic, deserves recognition for its portrayal of a peaceful scene in the Pacific Islands. A French whaling ship anchored near shore, lazily taking on water, with the sails and palm leaves hanging limp in the still air. It beautifully captures the rare moments of calm in the life of these hardy sailors. The second engraving, however, is more fitting for our discussion. It shows a ship cutting into a right whale on the open sea, with the vessel leaning over the whale's body as if it were a dock. A small boat is seen hurrying away from this busy scene, chasing whales in the distance. Harpoons and lances are ready for use, and 3 oarsmen are setting up the mast. A sudden wave lifts the boat out of the water like a rearing horse. Meanwhile, smoke rises from the ship, where the whale's fat is being boiled, and to the windward side, a dark cloud looms, signaling an approaching storm and quickening the crew's efforts. Chapter 57. Of whales in paint, in teeth, in wood, in sheet iron, in stone, in mountains, in stars. On Tower Hill, as you head down towards the London docks, you might have seen a crippled beggar, or kedger, as sailors call him, holding up a painted board showing the tragic scene in which he lost his leg. The painting depicts 3 whales and 3 boats, with one boat, presumably the one that held his leg, back when it was still intact, being crushed in the jaws of the lead whale. People tell me this man has been holding up that picture and showing off his stump for a decade, to the disbelief of passers-by. But now, his time for vindication has arrived. His whales are as real as any whales ever depicted in Wapping, and his stump is as undeniable as any you'll find in the western frontier. Though he's always standing on that stump, he never gives speeches. He just gazes sadly at his own amputation. Across the Pacific, in places like Nantucket, New Bedford, and Sag Harbor, you'll come across lively drawings of whales and whaling scenes, etched by the fishermen themselves on sperm whale teeth or women's corset stays made from right whale bone, and other similar items the whalers call scrimshaw. These sailors carve intricate designs into raw materials during their idle hours at sea. Some even have little toolkits for this scrimshaw work. But most just use their pocket knives. With this trusty tool, the sailor can carve anything you might want, whatever strikes his fancy. A long time away from civilization often returns a man to a more primal state, what we call savagery. A true whale hunter is as much a savage as an Iroquois warrior. I myself feel like a savage, loyal only to the king of the cannibals, and ready to rebel against him at any moment. One of the key traits of a savage during his time at home is his immense patience and dedication to his craft. An ancient Hawaiian war club or paddle, covered in intricate carvings, is just as much a testament to human perseverance as a Latin dictionary. These carvings were created with nothing more than a broken seashell or a shark's tooth, and they took years of steady, painstaking work. In the same way, a sailor savage, with his incredible patience and just one shark's tooth of a tool, his simple jackknife, can carve a piece of bone sculpture. It may not be as polished as something made by a professional, but the intricacy of the design rivals the shield of Achilles from Greek legend, and it's filled with raw energy and imagination, much like the prints of the great old Dutch artist, Albrecht Dürer. Wooden whale carvings, or whale profiles cut from dark pieces of South Sea hardwood, are common in the forecastles of American whaling ships. Some of them are impressively accurate. In some old country homes with gabled roofs, you'll see brass whale door knockers hanging by the tail. When the porter is feeling sleepy, the heavy-headed whale would be the best choice. But these door-knocking whales are rarely made to look realistic. On the spires of some old-fashioned churches, you'll see sheet iron whales used as weather vanes, but they're placed so high up and essentially marked with "do not touch," so you can't examine them closely enough to judge their accuracy. In rocky, barren parts of the world, where steep cliffs drop down onto plains scattered with oddly shaped stones, you might spot what look like the fossilized remains of whales, partially hidden in the grass, with the wind sweeping over them like ocean waves breaking on the shore. In mountainous areas, where the traveler is constantly surrounded by towering heights, you can sometimes catch glimpses of whale-like shapes along the undulating ridgelines, but you have to be a seasoned whaler to notice them. And if you want to see them again, you'd better mark the exact latitude and longitude of your viewpoint, because these sightings are so random that finding the same spot again could be as difficult as rediscovering the Solomon Islands. Lost to history, even though the explorers Mendana and Figuera once charted them. As you ponder this subject deeply, you can even see whales in the night sky, with boats chasing them, just like how ancient Eastern nations saw armies clashing in the clouds when they were consumed by thoughts of war. In the north, I've chased the Leviathan around and around the pole, following the stars that first outlined him for me. And under the brilliant skies of the Antarctic, I've climbed aboard the Argo Navis and joined in the hunt for the starry Cetus, far beyond the realms of the Hydra and the flying fish constellations. With a frigate's anchors for reins and bundles of harpoons for spurs, I wish I could mount that whale and leap into the highest heavens to see if the legendary lands, with their countless tents, truly exist beyond my mortal vision. Chapter 58. Brit. Steering northeast from the Crozet Islands, we came across vast fields of Brit, the tiny yellow substance that right whales mainly feed on. It stretched out for miles around us, making it feel like we were sailing through endless golden wheat fields. On the second day, we spotted many right whales swimming lazily through the Brit, safe from the threats of a sperm whaler like the Pequod. With their mouths wide open, they glided through the Brit, which stuck to the fine strands of the unique filters in their mouths, allowing the water to escape from their lips. They swam just like morning mowers, slowly moving their scythes through long, wet grass in marshy meadows, making a strange, grassy cutting sound and leaving behind trails of blue in the yellow sea. That part of the ocean, known to whalers as the Brazil Banks, gets its name not because of shallow areas like the banks of Newfoundland, but because of this remarkable meadow-like appearance created by the large amounts of Brit that constantly float in those waters, where right whales are often hunted. However, it was only the sound they made as they moved through the Brit that reminded one of mowers. From the mastheads, especially when they stopped and floated still for a while, their enormous black bodies looked more like lifeless rocks than anything else. Just like how someone in India might mistake a group of lying elephants for mere dark patches on the plains, a person seeing these leviathans for the first time might fail to recognize them. Even when identified, their immense size makes it hard to believe such massive forms can be alive, just like a dog or a horse. In many ways, you can't see deep-sea creatures in the same light as those found on land. Although some old naturalists argued that every land creature has its counterpart in the sea, this general view doesn't hold up when you consider the details. For instance, where can you find an ocean fish that displays the loyal nature of a dog? Only the dreaded shark can even be somewhat compared to it. Though people on land have generally viewed the native inhabitants of the sea with fear and repulsion, and despite knowing the ocean to be a vast unknown, so much so that Columbus sailed over countless undiscovered worlds to find just one superficial western one, and although countless terrible disasters have befallen those who venture onto the waters, a moment's thought reveals that no matter how much mankind boasts of its knowledge and skills, the ocean will forever insult and destroy him, shattering even the mightiest ships he can construct. Yet, through the constant repetition of these experiences, humanity has lost the sense of the sea's full terror that originally accompanied it. The first boat we know of floated on an ocean that, with Portuguese vengeance, swallowed up a whole world without leaving a single widow. That same ocean still rolls on. It was the same ocean that wrecked ships last year. Yes, foolish mortals, Noah's flood has not yet receded. 2/3 of the earth still lies beneath its waters. What makes the sea different from the land? That a miracle in one is not a miracle in the other? The ancient Hebrews felt great terror when the ground opened up and swallowed Korah and his followers. Yet not a single day passes without the live sea consuming ships and their crews in exactly the same way. But the sea is not only a foe to those unfamiliar with it, it can also be a fiend to its own offspring. It is worse than the Persian host who slaughtered their own guests, sparing not even the creatures it has given birth to. Like a savage tigress in the jungle that accidentally crushes her own cubs, the sea hurls even the largest whales against the rocks, leaving them alongside the splintered remains of ships. There is no mercy, no power but its own that controls it. Roaring and thrashing like a mad battle horse without a rider, the uncontrolled ocean sweeps across the globe. Consider the subtlety of the sea, how its most feared creatures glide underwater, often unseen, lurking beneath beautiful shades of blue. Also consider the deceptive brilliance and beauty of many of its most ruthless species, like the elegantly shaped sharks, and reflect once more on the universal cannibalism of the sea. All creatures prey on one another, engaging in eternal conflict since the beginning of time. Think about all of this, and then look at this green, gentle, and peaceful earth. Consider both the sea and the land. Do you not find a strange resemblance to something within yourself? Just as the terrifying ocean surrounds the lush land, there exists in the human soul an insular Tahiti, filled with peace and joy, but surrounded by the horrors of a partially understood life. God protect you. Do not leave that island. You can never return. Chapter 59. Squid. As the Pequod slowly waded through the fields of Brit, it continued its northeast course toward Java, propelled by a gentle breeze. In the surrounding tranquility, the three tall, tapering masts swayed softly in the languid air, resembling three palm trees on a plain. From time to time during the silvery night, a solitary jet of water would rise, drawing our attention. But one clear blue morning, a stillness settled over the sea, which was anything but stagnant. The long, shiny, sunlit path on the water appeared like a golden finger laid across its surface, hinting at some secret. The gentle waves whispered to each other as they rolled in. In this profound silence, Dagu spotted something strange from the crow's nest. In the distance, a large white mass rose lazily, gradually elevating itself from the blue until it gleamed before us like a snowslide freshly fallen from the hills. It sparkled for a moment before sinking again. It reappeared and glimmered silently. It didn't seem like a whale. Could it be Moby Dick? Dagu thought. Then the mysterious shape disappeared once more, but when it surfaced again, it let out a piercing cry that startled everyone awake. The black man shouted, "There! There again! It's breaching! Right ahead! The white whale! The white whale!" At this, the crew rushed to the yardarms like bees swarming to their hives. Bareheaded under the hot sun, Ahab stood on the bowsprit, one hand behind him, ready to signal to the helmsman, while he eagerly scanned the direction Dagu was pointing. Whether the presence of the solitary jet had influenced Ahab, leading him to associate calmness with the first sight of the specific whale he was after, or whether his eagerness got the better of him, it didn't matter. The moment he clearly saw the white mass, he quickly ordered the boats lowered. The 4 boats were soon in the water, Ahab's leading the way as they swiftly rowed toward their target. Just then, it went under, and while we paused, oars in hand, waiting for it to resurface, it slowly appeared again in the same spot where it had sunk. Almost forgetting about Moby Dick for a moment, we stared at the most incredible sight the secret seas had ever revealed to humanity. A vast, pulpy mass, several hundred yards long and wide, floated on the water, radiating countless long arms from its center that curled and twisted like a nest of snakes, as if blindly reaching for anything nearby. It had no discernible face or sign of sensation or instinct. It undulated on the waves like a strange, formless apparition of life. With a low sucking sound, it slowly sank again, and Starbuck, still gazing at the churning waters where it had disappeared, exclaimed in a wild voice, "I'd almost rather have fought Moby Dick than see you, you white ghost." "What was it, sir?" asked Flask. "The great live squid, which, they say, very few whaling ships have ever seen and returned to tell about." But Ahab didn't say anything. He turned his boat and sailed back to the ship, with the others silently following. Whatever superstitions sperm whalers generally associate with seeing this creature, it's clear that glimpsing it is so rare that it has taken on a sense of foreboding. It's so seldom seen that even though every whaler agrees it is the largest living thing in the ocean, very few have a clear understanding of its true nature and shape. Nonetheless, they believe it is the sole food source for the sperm whale. While other species of whales find their food at the surface and can be seen feeding, the sperm whale gets its entire diet from the mysterious depths below. People can only guess at what that food consists of. Sometimes, when pursued closely, it will regurgitate what appear to be the detached arms of the squid, some of which measure over 20 or 30 feet long. They speculate that the creature to which these arms belonged typically clings to the ocean floor, and unlike other whales, the sperm whale has teeth to bite and tear it. There is some basis to think that the great kraken described by Bishop Pontoppidan might actually be a squid. The way the bishop describes it, rising and sinking alternately, aligns with what has been said here. However, his descriptions exaggerate its size significantly. Some naturalists who have heard vague rumors about this mysterious creature classify it among cuttlefish, which it does resemble in certain external features, but only as a giant member of the group. Chapter 60. The Line. To better understand the whaling scene that will be described shortly, as well as similar scenes throughout this narrative, I need to discuss the whale line, which can be both magical and terrifying. The line originally used in whaling was made from the finest hemp, lightly coated with tar, but not soaked in it like regular ropes. Tar does make hemp more flexible for rope making and easier to handle for sailors during typical ship tasks. However, too much tar would make the whale line too stiff for the tight coils it must be stored in. Moreover, many sailors are realizing that while tar may give a rope a nice finish, it doesn't really improve its strength or durability. Recently, manila rope has almost completely replaced hemp for whale lines in American whaling. Although it isn't as durable as hemp, it is stronger, much softer, and more elastic. Plus, it looks more attractive on the boat. Hemp is dark and dull, like an Indian, while manila resembles a golden-haired Circassian. The whale line is only 2/3 of an inch thick. At first glance, you might not think it's as strong as it actually is. Each of its 51 yarns can hold a weight of 120 pounds, which means the entire rope can bear a load of nearly 3 tons. Typically, a sperm whale line is over 200 fathoms long. Toward the back of the boat, the line is spirally coiled in a tub, not like the worm pipe of a still, but in a round, cheese-like mass of tightly packed sheaves or layers of coils with only a small vertical tube in the center. Because even the smallest tangle could sever an arm, leg, or even drag a person overboard, great care is taken when stowing the line in its tub. Some harpooneers will spend almost the entire morning on this task, carefully raising the line and threading it down through a block to the tub, ensuring it's free of kinks and twists. In English whaling boats, 2 tubs are used instead of 1, with the same line coiled in both. This has its advantages. The twin tubs are smaller, making them fit better in the boat without putting too much strain on it. In contrast, the American tub is nearly 3 feet in diameter and deep, making it a bulky load for a boat with only half-inch thick planks. The bottom of the whale boat can support a widely distributed weight, but not a concentrated one. When the canvas cover is put on the American line tub, the boat looks like it's carrying a massive wedding cake for the whales. Both ends of the line are exposed. The lower end has an eye splice or loop that comes up from the bottom of the tub, hanging over its edge, and completely free from anything. This setup is necessary for 2 reasons. First, it makes it easier to attach an additional line from another boat if the wounded whale dives deep enough to take the entire line connected to the harpoon. In these cases, the whale is essentially transferred from one boat to another, while the first boat stays close by to help. Second, this arrangement is essential for safety. If the lower end of the line were attached to the boat and the whale suddenly took off with the line, it could easily drag the boat down into the depths of the sea, where it would never be found. Before launching the boat for the chase, the upper end of the line is taken from the tub, wrapped around the loggerhead, and then stretched along the entire length of the boat. It rests across the handles of each rower's oars, brushing against their wrists as they row, and passes between the men sitting on either side of the boat. It goes into the leaded chocks or grooves at the pointed front of the boat, where a wooden pin keeps it from slipping out. From the chocks, it hangs slightly over the bow and is pulled back inside the boat again, with about 10 or 20 fathoms, called box line, coiled in the box at the front. It continues along the side of the boat, further back, and connects to the short warp, the rope linked to the harpoon. However, before making that connection, the short warp goes through various complex twists that I won't detail here. Thus, the whale line wraps around the whole boat in complicated coils, twisting in almost every direction. The oarsmen are entangled in its dangerous loops, making them look like Indian jugglers with deadly snakes playfully coiling around them. Anyone new to this situation, seated among these hempen tangles and straining at the oars, must think that at any moment the harpoon could be launched, activating all those terrifying twists like flashing lightning. No man can be in this position without feeling a shudder that makes his bones tremble like jelly. Yet, strangely enough, what can habit accomplish? You'll hear more laughter, better jokes, and brighter banter over the half-inch white cedar of a whaleboat, even while tangled in this dangerous line, than you might around your own dinner table. The 6 crew members, like the 6 citizens of Calais before King Edward, bravely pull into the jaws of death with a noose around each neck. It doesn't take much thought to understand why there are so many whaling accidents, like those casually recorded instances of someone being pulled from the boat by the line and lost. When the line is shooting out, being seated in the boat feels like sitting in the middle of a steam engine, with every moving part threatening to graze you. It's worse, though, because you can't sit still amid these dangers. The boat rocks like a cradle, tossing you from side to side without warning. You can only avoid being thrown into the chaos by balancing yourself and acting simultaneously. Otherwise, you risk becoming a victim, disappearing where even the sun could never find you. Moreover, the eerie calm that often precedes a storm can be more terrifying than the storm itself. The calm is merely a cover for the impending storm, just like an innocuous-looking rifle contains deadly powder, a bullet, and the potential for an explosion. The graceful stillness of the line, as it quietly winds around the oarsman before being put to use, holds a deeper terror than any other aspect of this dangerous situation. But why say more? All men live surrounded by whale lines. We are all born with nooses around our necks, but it's only when caught in the swift, sudden grip of death that we realize the quiet, subtle, ever-present dangers of life. And if you're a philosopher, sitting in a whaleboat, you wouldn't feel any more fear than if you were sitting by your evening fire with a poker beside you instead of a harpoon.